Hey everybody! Chapter 27, Mockingbird. We're getting close to the end. It goes fast. Now, 26 was the school chapter, the current event, Hitler, persecuting others, Scout, Gem, uh, grief. Remember that? That was at the end of that chapter. That was kind of all that was in that chapter. Yeah. Scout talked a little bit about Boo Radley in that chapter, like walking by, and she's grown up now. She's too cool. It doesn't bother her anymore. Chapter 27. Things did settle down after a fashion, as Atticus said they would. By the middle of October, only two small things out of the ordinary had happened to make him citizens. No, there were three things, and they did not directly concern us, the Finches, but in a way they did. The first thing was that Mr. Bob Ewell acquired and lost a job in a matter of days, and probably made himself unique in the annuals of the 1930s. He was the only man I ever heard who was fired from the WPA for laziness. I suppose his brief burst of fame brought on a briefer burst of industry, of hard work, but his job lasted only as long as his notoriety. Mr. Ewell found himself as forgotten as Tom Robinson. Thereafter, he resumed his regular weekly appearances at the welfare office for his check and received it with no grace amid obscure mutterings that the bastards who thought they ran this town wouldn't permit an honest man to make a living. Ruth Jones, the welfare lady, said Mr. Ewell openly accused Atticus of getting his job. She was upset enough to walk down to Atticus's office and tell him about it. Atticus told Miss Ruth not to fret, that if Bob Ewell wanted to discuss Atticus getting his job, he knew the way to his office. The second thing happened to Judge Taylor. Judge Taylor was not a Sunday night church goer, but Mrs. Taylor was. Judge Taylor savored his Sunday night hour alone in his big house, and his church time found him holed up in his study reading the writings of Bob Taylor. No relation, but the judge would have been proud to claim it. One Sunday night, lost in fruity metaphors and florid diction, Judge Taylor's attention was wrenched from the page by an irritating scratching noise. "Hush," he said to Ann Taylor, his fat, nondescript dog. Dogs with people names. Then he realized he was speaking to an empty room. The scratching noise was coming from the rear of the house. Judge Taylor clumped to the back porch to let Ann out and found the screen door swinging open. A shadow on the corner of the house caught his eye, and that was all he saw of his visitor. Mrs. Taylor came home from church to find her husband in his chair, lost in the writings of Bob Taylor, with a shotgun across his lap. First of all, it's nighttime, and I'm a little scared by that. So somebody was trying to break into the judge's house because they thought that no one was home, but they didn't get in. And the judge went and got a gun and had it sitting on his lap just in case they did, so that he was prepared. The third thing happened to Helen Robinson, Tom's widow. If Mr. Ewell was as forgotten as Tom Robinson, Robinson was as forgotten as Boo Radley. But Tom was not forgotten by his employer, Mr. Link Dees. Mr. Link Dees made a job for Helen. He didn't really need her, but he said he felt right bad about the way things turned out. I never knew who took care of her children while Helen was away. Calpurnia said it was hard on Helen because she had to walk nearly a mile out of her way to avoid the Ewells, who, according to Helen, chunked at her the first time she tried to use the public road. They threw things at her and said bad things to her as she walked by. Mr. Link Dees eventually received the impression that Helen was coming to work each morning from the wrong direction, and he dragged the reason out of her. "Just let it be, Mr. Link, please, sir," Helen begged. "Hell I will," said Link Dees. He told her to come by his store that afternoon before she left. So she did, and Mr. Link Dees closed the store, put his hat firmly on his head, and walked Helen home. He walked her the short way, by the Ewells. On his way back, Mr. Link stopped at the crazy gate. "Ewell?" he called. "I say, Ewell!" The windows, normally packed with children, were empty. "I know every last one of you is in there laying on that floor. Now hear me, Bob Ewell. If I hear one more peep out of my girl Helen about not being able to walk this road, I'll have you in jail before sundown." Mr. Link spat in the dust and walked home. Helen went to work the next morning and used the public road. Nobody chunked at her, but when she was a few yards beyond the Ewell house, she looked around and saw Mr. Ewell walking behind her. She turned and walked on, but Mr. Ewell kept the same distance behind her until she reached Mr. Link Dees's house. All the way to the house, Helen said. She heard a soft voice behind her, crooning foul words. Thoroughly frightened, she telephoned Mr. Link at his store, which was not too far from his house. As Mr. Link came out of his store, he saw Mr. Yule leaning on the fence. Mr. Yule said, "Don't you look at me, Link D's, like I was dirt. I ain't jumped your—" "First thing you can do, Yule," interrupted Link, "is get your stinking carcass off my property. You're leaning on it, and I can't afford a fresh paint for it. Second thing you can do is stay away from my cook, or I'll have you up for assault." "I ain't touched her, Link D's. I ain't about to go with no nigger." "You don't have to touch her. All you have to do is make her afraid. And if assault ain't enough to keep you locked up a while, I'll get you in on the ladies' law. So get out of my sight. If you don't think I mean it, just bother that girl again." Mr. Yule evidently thought he meant it, for Helen reported no further trouble. "I don't like it, Atticus. I don't like it at all," was Anne Alexander's assessment of these events. "That man seems to have a permanent running grudge against everybody connected with that case. I know how that kind are about paying off grudges, but I don't understand why he should harbor one. He had his way in court, didn't he?" "I think I understand," said Atticus. "It might be because he knows that in his heart, very few people in Macomb really believed him and Mayella's yarns. That's like his story. He thought he'd be a hero, but all he got for his pain was, 'Okay, we'll convict this Negro, but get back to your dump.' He's had his fling with about everybody now, so he ought to be satisfied. He'll settle down when the weather changes." "But why should he try to burgle Judge Taylor's house? He obviously didn't know the judge was home, or he wouldn't have tried. Only lights John shows on Sunday nights are on the front porch and is back in his den." "You don't know if Bobby will cut that screen. You don't know who did it," said Atticus. "But I can guess. I proved him a liar, but John made him look like a fool. All the time Yule was on the stand, I couldn't dare look at John and keep a straight face. John looked at him as if he were a three-legged chicken or a square egg." "Don't tell me judges don't try to prejudice juries," Atticus chuckled. By the end of October, our lives had become the familiar routine of school, play, and study. Jem seemed to have put out of his mind whatever it was he wanted to forget, and our classmates mercifully let us forget our father's eccentricities. Cecil Jacobs asked me one time if Atticus was a radical. When I asked Atticus, Atticus was so amused I was rather annoyed, but he said he wasn't laughing at me. He said, "You tell Cecil I'm about as radical as Cotton Tom Heflin." Anne Alexander was thriving. Miss Maudie must have silenced the whole missionary society at one blow, for Auntie ruled the roost. Her refreshments grew even more delicious. I learned more about the poor Myrna's social life from listening to Miss Merriweather. They had so little sense of family that the whole tribe was one big family. A child had as many fathers as there were men in the community, and as many mothers as there were women. J. Grimes Everett was doing his utmost to change this state of affairs and desperately needed our prayers. Macomb was itself again, precisely the same as last year and the year before that, with only two minor changes. Firstly, people had removed from their store windows and automobiles the stickers that said, "NRA, we do our part." I asked Atticus why, and he said it was because the National Recovery Act was dead. I asked who killed it. He said 9 old men. That's a historical and political allusion. 9 old men is referring to the Supreme Court and ruling that the National Recovery Act was not legal. I don't know the history on that. The second change in Macomb since last year was not one of national significance. Until then, Halloween in Macomb was a completely unorganized affair. Each child did what he wanted to do with assistance from other children. If there was anything to be moved, such as placing a light buggy on top of the livery stable. They're talking about pranks. But parents thought things went too far last year when the peace of Miss Tootie and Miss Fruity were shattered. This is the prank they pulled last Halloween. Mrs. Tootie and Fruity Barber were maiden ladies, sisters, who lived together in the only Macomb residence boasting a cellar. The Barber ladies were rumored to be Republicans, having migrated from Clanton, Alabama in 1911. Their ways were strange to us, and why they wanted a cellar nobody knew. But they wanted one, and they dug one, and they spent the rest of their lives chasing generations of children out of it. Mrs. Tootie and Fruity, their names were Sarah and Frances, aside from their Yankee ways, were both deaf. Mrs. Tootie denied it and lived in a world of silence. But Miss Fruity, not about to miss anything, employed an ear trumpet so enormous that Jem declared it was a loudspeaker from one of those dog Victrolas. You ever see those pictures of like the old record players with the big like horn thing? That's a Victrola. So they're so deaf that she would like put that thing in her ear so she could hear. With all these facts in mind and Halloween at hand, had some wicked children had waited until the Mrs. Barbers were thoroughly asleep, slipped into their living room, nobody but the Radleys locked up at night, stealthily made away with every stick of furniture therein, and hid it in the cellar. I deny having taken part in such a thing. I heard them was the cry. So they took the furniture and they put it like in the back garage. The cellar is what they like where they would hide from tornadoes, in the cellar. So they snuck into their house, took every piece of furniture, the couch and the chairs and everything, and put it in their own garage. I heard them was the cry that awoke the Mrs. Barber's neighbors at dawn the next morning. Heard them drive a truck up to the door, stomped around like horses. They're in New Orleans by now. Miss Tootie was sure those traveling fur sellers who came through town 2 days ago had purloined and stolen their furniture. Dark they were, she said. Syrians. Mr. Hecate was summoned. He surveyed the area and said that he thought it was a local job. Miss Fruity said she'd know a Macon voice anywhere, and there were no Macon voices in the parlor that last night. Rolling their R's over her premises they were. Nothing less than the bloodhounds must be used to locate their furniture, Miss Tootie insisted, so Mr. Tate was obliged to go 10 miles out the road, round up the county hounds, and put them on the trail. Mr. Tate started them off at Mrs. Barber's front steps, but all they did was run around to the back of the house and howl at the cellar door. When Mr. Tate set them in motion 3 times, he finally guessed the truth. By noontime that day, there was not a barefooted child to be seen in Macon, and nobody took off his shoes until the hounds were returned. They thought they'd get caught because they were barefooted and the hounds could smell them. Late night reading, man. So the Macon ladies said things would be different this year. Okay, now we're back in the present. They're going to do Halloween different so the kids don't do a prank. The high school auditorium would be open. There would be a pageant for the grown-ups, apple bobbing, taffy pulling, pinning the tail on the donkey for the children. There would also be a prize of 25 cents for the best Halloween costume created by the wearer. Jem and I both groaned. Not that we'd ever done anything. It was the principle of the thing. Jem considered himself too old for Halloween anyway. He said he wouldn't be caught anywhere near the high school at something like that. Oh well, I thought, Atticus would take me. I soon learned, however, that my services would be required on stage that evening. Mrs. Grace Merriweather had composed an original pageant entitled Macomb County at a Straw per Aspera, and I was to be a ham. Pause. Were you ever in an elementary school play? What were you? Were you a rock? Were you a tree? Were you a sheep? I was Little Bo Peep, just so you know. Ask me that story someday. It's a lovely story. I was to be a ham, said Scout. She thought it would be adorable if some of the children were costumed to represent the county's agricultural products. Cecil Jacobs would be dressed up to look like a cow. Agnes Boone would make a lovely butterbean, and another child would be a peanut, and on down the line until Mrs. Merriweather's imagination and the supply of children were exhausted. Only our duties, as far as I could gather from our 2 rehearsals, were to enter the stage on the left as Miss Merriweather, not only the author but the narrator, identified us. When she called out, "Pork!" that was my cue. Then the assembled company would sing, Macomb County, we will I be true to thee, as the grand finale, and Miss Merriweather would mount the stage with the state flag. Woo! My costume was not much of a problem. Miss Crenshaw, the local seamstress, had as much imagination as Miss Merriweather. Miss Crenshaw took some chicken wire and bent it into the shape of a cured ham. This she covered with brown cloth and painted it to resemble the original. I could duck under and someone would pull the contraption down over my head. It came almost to my knees. Miss Crenshaw thoughtfully left 2 peepholes for me. She did a fine job. Jem said I looked exactly like a ham with legs. There were several discomforts, though. It was hot. It was a close fit. If my nose itched, I couldn't scratch it. And once inside, I could not get out of it alone. When Halloween came, I assumed that the whole family would be present to watch me perform, but I was disappointed. Atticus said as tactfully as he could that just didn't think he could stand a pageant tonight. He was all in. He had been in Montgomery for a week and had come home late that afternoon. He thought Jem might escort me if I asked him. Anne Alexander said she had to get to bed early. She'd been decorating the stage all afternoon, was worn out. She'd stopped short in the middle of her sentence. She closed her mouth and opened it to say something, but no words came out. "What's the matter, Auntie?" I asked. "Oh, nothing, nothing," she said. "Somebody just walked over my grave." She put away her whatever it was that gave her a pinprick of apprehension and suggested that I give the family a preview in the living room. So Jem squeezed me into my costume, stood at the living room door, and called out, "Pork!" exactly as Miss Merriweather would have done, and I marched in. Atticus and Aunt Alexander were delighted. I repeated my part for Calpurnia in the kitchen, and she said I was wonderful. I wanted to go across the street and show Miss Maudie, but Jem said she'd probably be at the pageant anyway. After that, it didn't matter whether they went or not. Jem said he would take me. Thus began our longest journey together. So Scouts Ham it's Halloween. Scouts of Ham. They're gonna have a little Halloween fair. They're gonna do a little play about Macomb County. Notice the last line in that chapter. We're gonna talk about that later. Thus began our longest journey together. We're gonna talk about that later. I am done for today. That is chapter 27 done. See you for 28.